Is the New Testament reliable history? That's today's topic for the Garrison. We live in a world where there is more access to information than ever before. Generations, young and old, are being exposed to radically different ideologies and opinions every day. It can be so overwhelming trying to decipher what's true and what's false. But there is a way. Join me as we discuss some of the toughest questions out there about Christianity, the Bible, and culture. I'm your host, Nick Lackey. Welcome to the Garrison. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Garrison. Thanks for joining me. And as mentioned before, today we're going to be looking at, is the New Testament reliable history? Now, I have actually done a video on the resurrection of Jesus before, and we looked at historical evidence for it. But today, what I want to do is create a podcast episode or a video which is just very, very thorough. So it might be a wee bit longer than normal. And it's a video which I want to be able to recommend to people in the future, in my own life. If I want to just point people to the overwhelming evidence for the resurrection of Jesus and the reliability of the New Testament, I want to do this video well, I want to be thorough, and I want it to be a video which I can refer people to if they are truly looking for evidence. And hopefully, as the audience, you guys can refer this video to people as well if you find it helpful. And so let's get into it. The first thing I want to say is that there are some statements that people make about the Bible, or maybe in specific the New Testament. Maybe they might say the Bible's just a bunch of myths. Maybe they'll say, well, it was just written by men. How can we know that it was truly the Word of God if it was written by men? Or maybe they will say there's no good evidence for the Bible. Now, are these statements true? Can they be backed up by other evidence? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, there's three questions we have to ask when asking, are the Gospels or is the New Testament reliable history? And the first one is, can we trust the witnesses? Now, I learnt these questions off of someone who is a lawyer, and this is a lawyer's approach to the question, I suppose. But first thing they ask is, can we trust the witnesses? Can we trust their testimony? Number two, has their testimony changed over time? And number three, is there corroborating evidence for their testimony? Is there other evidence which is backing up these statements? So number one, can we trust the witnesses? Now I'm going to make a few points while we talk about this first question. And the first point I want to make is that the New Testament sounds like written history. You might ask, well, what's the significance of that, Nick? Well, it doesn't start with once upon a time, or it doesn't start with in a galaxy far, far away. Instead, it starts like you would expect a written historical document to sound like. If we look at the book of Luke, and in his eyewitness testimony, this is what it says. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. This is who the message is directed to, Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now ask yourself, does that sound like a made-up fable or a myth? I think that sounds like written history. Again, in chapter 3 of Luke, it says, Now, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea. Now, in this statement here, in Luke chapter 3, we have the exact year, which is when the events are taking place. We have the exact ruler, we have the exact governor and the location, and we have the exact tetrarchs and their locations. Again, this is it's written as if it is written history. Not only is it written, and it sounds like written history, but we also have the New Testament writers claiming that it's written history. In chapter 1 of 1 Peter, it says, For we did not follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Again, they're claiming that they are eyewitnesses to these events. In 1 John chapter 1, verse 1 to 3, It says, what was from the beginning, what we have heard and what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life, what we have seen and heard, we proclaim to you also. Again, they're claiming that they are eyewitnesses to these events, and they are proclaiming what they saw, what they heard, what they touched, and they are using their senses to show us that this was truly historical events that took place. And so, quick recap so far. They sound like written history. The New Testament writers claim that they are written history. Number 3, there are embarrassing details included in the Gospels. Now, why is this significant? Well, let's suppose for a minute that the New Testament writers actually made all of it up. It was a made-up story, and they did it with, I don't know what their intention would be if it was made up. We'll talk about that in a minute. But why would you, if it was made up, why would you include embarrassing details about yourself? Right, the disciples include details of their cowardness. For example, when Jesus was led off to be crucified, they fled. They didn't stay with him to comfort him. No, they fled out of fear for their own life. They also record down that it was the woman in Jesus' circle that saw the resurrected Jesus first. Now, this was a very silly thing to do if you're trying to get people to believe you, because at the time, women's testimony wasn't held as trustworthy as a man's testimony. Yet, as I believe it is truly written history, and these are the events that actually took place, they record it as the woman who were the first eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection. The disciples also record how ignorant and unaware they are, and they were. I mean, if you read the Gospels, you'll see many times when Jesus will explain a spiritual teaching, and then they'll just have no clue what he's talking about. They'll ask Jesus, "What do you mean by that?" And to us as the reader, it may seem pretty clear now, but they were pretty unaware. Jesus literally tells them at one stage that he's going to basically die and rise from the dead, and then they got confused about that. And so they're not really painting themselves in a very good picture. And why would you do that if you're creating a story about yourself? In Matthew 16, it says, "Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, 'Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you.' But then Jesus says, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men.'" Now, why would the New Testament writers include this stuff about themselves? They don't paint themselves in a very nice picture. And in the Gospel of Matthew, we have the genealogy of Jesus, and it includes prostitutes. Now, if you're making up a story about the Savior of the world, you probably wouldn't put prostitutes in his genealogy. But I believe the reason that they are there is because this is true written history. This is the way that things actually happen. So number 3, they include embarrassing details, right? And this is all to do with the first question of, can we trust the witnesses and what they're saying? Number 4, they had no motivation to lie. Why would they create this story about Jesus, about his death and resurrection and his forgiveness of sins, if all it led to was them being beaten, tortured, and killed? Normally when someone tells a lie, it's in order to benefit yourself, right? You might tell a lie to get away from trouble, or to make yourself look better, or to gain some sort of wealth or health or power or whatever it may be. But the disciples didn't get any of this. Instead, they got beaten, and all the disciples except John were martyred. And John was exiled to the island of Patmos, which is where he had the revelation and wrote Revelation. But they had no motivation to lie about the things they had seen. There was no worldly wealth or power that they received from this. They lived a life of earthly pain for the sake of the gospel. Some people might say that their testimony was written down in blood. They were willing to die for what they claimed that they had seen. And that's, I believe, a pretty powerful thing. And number 5, even historians who are critics of the gospel take them, or at least most of them, to be written history. There's a guy called Bart Ehrman, and he's a famous skeptic, but he still admits that much of the gospel is written history. He may not believe in the resurrection of Christ, but he admits that they include much of written history. So that's our first question. Can we trust the witnesses? And I would say absolutely we can. They sound like written history. The writers claim that they are written history. They include embarrassing details of themselves. They had no motivation to lie. And even historians who are critics of the Gospels take most of them to be written history. I think that's a pretty good case for saying that, yes, we can trust the the witnesses. Now let's assume that we can trust the witnesses here. How do we know, this is our second question, how do we know that their testimony hasn't changed over time? Often I'll hear people say that the Gospels or the Bible is a bit like Chinese whispers, right? If you don't know what Chinese whispers is, it's a game that we used to play as kids, and basically you would have one simple message, and then you would get a big line of people or a big circle of kids normally, and then they would have to whisper it into each other's ear. And as it went through the line of ears, by the time it got to the end, the statement might have been completely different. And it was pretty funny. It's quite a fun game to play. But the point is, when you've got one person whispering to another person, to another person, to another person, the testimony or the sentence is probably going to change. Now, is this what happened with the New Testament? Is this how the history was recorded? Is it just a long list of people who verbally told each other the gospel, and then finally, not long ago, we decided to write it down? Not at all. Picture this. This is different than our Chinese whispers example. Picture this. A high school teacher, they write down a sentence on the board, and then they tell their 40 students to carefully copy the content down, word for word. How do you think it would go? If all these kids looked at the sentence and they recorded it down, and then the teacher went and rubbed out the example on the whiteboard, and we had no original sentence, do you think we would still be able to figure out what that sentence was? Now, maybe among these 40 students, there were 2 or 3 who were really, really bad at school, and they did a terrible job at writing down the sentence. Now, do you think we could still figure out what the sentence was? I still think we could. We would look at the 37 other students and look at the sentences that they wrote down, and maybe there was an error here and there was another error here, but because we have so many other copies of the original, we can compare them and we can figure out what the original was. And this is a more accurate way of looking at how the Gospels were recorded throughout history. So we'll look at the reliability of the New Testament documents. We have some documents which claim that he died and he rose again. This is Jesus. How do we know that this is true? How do we know that they haven't been changed throughout time? Well, first let's deal with what's called the time gap. This is the time gap between the original writing and the first surviving copies. Now, the earlier the better, because the more time you have between the original event and the copies, or the original manuscript and the copies, then the more time you have for myths and legends to form and errors to come in. And so, in general, normally we take historians' work even when the time gap is about 1,000 years, okay? We accept most historians' work even when the time gap is 1,000 years. But with the New Testament document, or with the New Testament documents, it's not thousands of years, it's not hundreds of years, but it's estimated to only be about 25 years. Myths and legends take time to develop over generations, but in this instance, we have copies which are far too early to have developed any myths, right? Now, in comparison, the New Testament, which has this time gap of about 25 years, and Pliny, who's another historian, I believe, the earliest surviving copy is 750 years afterwards. Caesar is 1,000, Tacitus 1,000, Plato 1,200. New Testament, 25 years. I think that's incredible. It is an extremely small time gap when we're talking about ancient history. And most historians would take this to be extremely reliable because there hasn't been much time for the original to have been changed. Now, not only is the time gap important, but we also have the number of manuscript copies. Let's say that we had 3 or 4 copies. We might be able to argue that because we had so few, we can't really trust if they are loyal to the original copy. Other historic documents from people like Tacitus and Plato and Pliny, they have no more than about 20. Homer, who is considered one of the most influential authors in history, we only have about 1,800 manuscripts, which is well accepted as being reliable enough. However, with the New Testament, we have 5,800 copies. 5,800 copies. In comparison to these other manuscript copies of other ancient texts, this is massive, absolutely massive. And so because we have such a short time gap between the original and the manuscript copies, and because we have so many copies of the original, 5,800, therefore we can go through, we can compare them all and figure out what the original said. And that's what we have today in the Bible. And that is why we can trust that the testimony hasn't changed. Dr. Daniel Wallace, who is a New Testament scholar, he says, we have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone in the ancient world. Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, anyone. And I do believe that is true. There is so much manuscript copies, such a small time gap, so much evidence, physical, tangible evidence that we can believe that this is truly written histories, that we can trust the witnesses and we know that their testimonies have not changed. What's written down in our Bibles today is the same thing that the New Testament writers wrote down when they put pen to paper. So that's our first two questions. Can we trust the witnesses, and has their testimony changed? I believe we can trust the witnesses, and that at least we've built a good case to say that we can trust them and that their testimony has not changed. But number three, is there corroborating evidence? Is there evidence outside of the New Testament? Is there archaeological evidence which corroborates what the New Testament writers were saying? Do they corroborate one another as well? Do the pieces of evidence connect together to prove a story? Well, first of all, the authors of the New Testament, they are all writing one story. And there's something which happens when you read them side by side, and this is what's called an undesigned coincidence. Different authors describing the same event, but they give different details. For example, in Matthew 26, verse 67, when it's describing the process of Jesus' trial and the moments before he's crucified, it says, "Then they spit in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him and said, 'Prophesy to us, you Christ, who is the one who hit you?'" Now initially when we read that by itself, we might think, why are they asking Christ to prophesy to them? Can't he just look and see? Well, when we read this in conjunction with Luke chapter 22, verse 63, it says, "The men who were holding Jesus in custody began mocking him and beating him, and they blindfolded him and repeatedly asked him, saying, 'Prophesy, who is the one who hit you?'" And so you can see we've got two descriptions of the same event, one in Matthew, one in Luke. And when we read Matthew, we might ask, well, why are they asking who hit you? But in Luke, it gives us the answer. It's because they blindfolded him. And so they were mocking him and saying, well, you can't see who hit you, but if you're really the Christ, then you should know. And so this is called an undesigned coincidence. And there's many of these throughout the gospel. So they corroborate one another, and they go to show that the authors are writing one story. Now that's biblical corroboration. That's corroboration between the different accounts of Jesus given to us in the Bible. But we also have extra biblical corroboration. This is when people outside of the Bible, often they are religious leaders or historians, they write down things which corroborate, and that just basically means agrees with what the Bible said. Now, Flavius Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he wrote, "Ananias brought before the Sanhedrin a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and condemned them to be stoned to death." And this corroborates what the New Testament said. And it speaks of this guy called Jesus, who was called Christ. Josephus also writes, "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good." Now take note of what we're hearing from these extra biblical sources. "He was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who would become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive." Wow! Isn't that amazing that we have this Jewish historian who's corroborating the New Testament by what he's saying. He's saying that Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. His disciples reported that he'd appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Now we're starting to build a case for actually, no, this probably wasn't just a made-up myth, that most of the ancient world had heard about this guy called Jesus, particularly the ones up in the higher places, like the historians. Now, in Wikipedia, it says, we're about to talk about the Talmud. I think I've said that right. The Talmud is the basis for all codes of Jewish law and is widely quoted in rabbinic literature. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that word. But basically, it's a very important Jewish document. And in the Talmud, it says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua was hanged because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Right? Now, obviously, that's their biased opinion there, because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. But we have here that Yeshua, which is Jesus' name, he was hanged. And when it says hanged, that's referring to the crucifixion. He was hung on the cross. So we have Josephus, we have the Talmud, we also have Lucian. And he says, the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage. Again, we've got more historical corroboration from extra-biblical sources who are describing Christians, describing Jesus, describing his crucifixion. This one here claims that he's some sort of sage. We also have Cornelius Tacitus, who I believe was a Roman historian. He said, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, but the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Boom, again, we've got more extra-biblical corroboration. We have a Jewish historian, we have the Jewish Talmud, we have a Greek writer, I believe that was Lucian, and we have Tacitus, we have a Roman historian. And these are, all up, there's about 17 ancient non-biblical sources corroborating what the New Testament writers said. And these extra-biblical sources are people that ancient historians, or rather historians today, claim are reliable ancient historians. Now, if we remove the biblical accounts from the story, what can we conclude from all of these statements from the extra-biblical sources we have just looked at? Well, we know that there was a wise, virtuous sage from Judea named Jesus Christ. They claim that he had supernatural power, or sorcery, that he had a brother named James, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The disciples reported him alive after 3 days, and he had a following named Christians who believed in immortality and worshipped Jesus as God. And we get that all from secular sources. Now, that's overwhelming corroboration. That's overwhelming historical corroboration for the Bible. So if anyone ever says there's no evidence for the Bible, or there's no reason to believe that their New Testament is true, I'd say that's absolutely incorrect. We have so much evidence. And we haven't even finished here. Now we're going to look at archaeological corroboration. In 1961, archaeologists discovered a stone in Caesarea that said Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. We have archaeology which goes to show that this was a true guy, that Pontius Pilate really did exist. Now, John mentions the pool of Bethesda having 5 what's called porticos, which are kind of like, what are they? Decks, I think. I could be wrong. But John mentions the pool of Bethesda having 5 porticos. Now, in 1888, it was discovered the remains of a pool that had 5 shallow porticos in the same location, which John describes them. So we have archaeological evidence that the places, the locations mentioned in the New Testament were true places. Archaeology, and this is just a few of the discoveries, corroborates the New Testament as well. So in conclusion, man, I feel like I've just been talking for a while. Maybe this is a long one. I can't tell because I've just been hooning through it. But conclusion, number 1, we have good reason to trust the witnesses because it sounds like written history. It is claimed to be written history by the writers. There are embarrassing details included in there. They died for their testimony. They didn't gain anything from creating this myth, as some people claim it to be. And even non-Christian historians take some of it as literal history. Number 2, the message hasn't changed. There are thousands of manuscript copies, which is historical gold, and the closest ones are super early, which allows no time for myths and legends and false details to form. And they can corroborate one another. Number 3, there's a bunch of corroborating evidence. The New Testament writers corroborate each other with these undesigned coincidences. We have extra biblical sources that corroborate the history as well. We talked about them. And we have archaeology that corroborates the New Testament as well. There we have it. I'm convinced. I think that's a good case to believe that the Gospels are reliable history. The Bible isn't just a bunch of myths written down by people who were creating stories. Yes, they were written by men, but that doesn't just mean that they were automatically unreliable. Your science textbooks are written by men. Your history textbooks are written by men. Doesn't make them wrong. And people who say that there's no good evidence for the New Testament to be true, really? If you actually hear all of that evidence which I just talked about, is that a reasonable statement to make? At least, as some of the New Testament scholars who aren't Christians, at least we can acknowledge that they are written like historical documents and that they do contain historical information. While you may not believe in the resurrection of Christ, at least we can confidently say that Jesus was a real person who died on the cross. But people just seem to have a problem with the resurrection part because automatically they assume that miracles aren't possible. And I've talked about this on this podcast before. I can't remember what episode it was, but often we come into the question of did the resurrection really happen with a presupposition that it's impossible for resurrections to happen. We don't let the evidence lead us wherever it will go. We don't follow it wherever the evidence will lead us. Instead, we say, well, miracles are impossible, therefore there must be a natural explanation. But you're limiting where the evidence can lead you based on your own philosophy. And I don't think that is wise. I think we need to be open to supernatural events happening if the evidence points us towards that. So that is the end of this episode. I will stop talking. There's probably a lot to take in from that. You may not have taken it all in, so feel free to listen to it again, to go back and to make sure that you understand all of the evidence for the New Testament, that we can trust that it is truly reliable history. And if it is truly reliable history, then we can trust that Jesus truly has died on the cross for our sin, that if we've ever stolen or lied or looked with lust or dishonored our parents or hated someone without cause, if we've broken God's law, which we all have, then we deserve hell. We deserve to be punished for it. God's not going to reward us for that. But because he loves you so much, he died on the cross. As the history says he did. He died on that cross and took the punishment for our sins, that if we repent of our sin and put our faith in him, we will be saved. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to share it with people or to rate it on whatever platform you're listening. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next episode of The Garrison.